Over the past year or so, I've seen more and more professional DPs and content creators using cell phones on professional sets, primarily for social deliverables. I've owned the iPhone 15 since it came out, but I haven't really dove into iPhone filmmaking. But that being said, I wanted to be more familiar with the iPhone ecosystem in terms of what I would want to do and what I would want to have if I was asked to shoot on an iPhone for social deliverables. I recently took a trip to the Pacific Northwest and wanted to use that as an opportunity to practice my iPhone filmmaking techniques. If you're new here, my name's Keaton. I am a DP that's been working for a little bit over the decade, primarily in the commercial space. I've always had a knack or an interest in finding my own solutions and boosting efficiencies, especially on set. In fact, earlier this year, I made an app called CineTemp that's available, but essentially what it does is it tells you the white balance of a room really quickly, which is very handy for doc settings, quick commercial, or tourism work. There's other tools that are similar in ways, but this one's a little bit different with its UI design, and it tells you everything in a really clean format. But all that being said, I wanted to take this trip and find what I liked about iPhone filmmaking and what I would change and put into a professional, practical application. So today this video is going to be about what I learned filmmaking on the iPhone for a little bit over a week. I want to talk about my favorite apps that I use, my favorite accessories, and then finally talk about some tips when color grading the footage and kind of how it holds up in post. I posted a video last week of a film emulation that I did with some of the clips from the PMW, and so I want to talk about what I used, how I used it, and then we'll get into my favorite apps. Let's start by talking about my favorite apps that I used while filming on the iPhone. The first being the Blackmagic camera app. Now, one of my favorite things about this app is their UI. If you know anything about Blackmagic cameras, I personally think that they have the best camera UI in the industry, and they implemented that on this app. Overall, the app offers a lot. The user interface is great, there's a lot of really good tools, you get a lot of options for recording in different codecs, and then finally, it's totally free. So having this asset available as a total free application is pretty bonkers. So if you're starting out with an iPhone 15 or above and you want very good footage and you don't want to invest any more money into an app, then start here. But I think there's also a few downsides. So with some other apps, you have the ability to shoot open gate on the sensor of the iPhone. This app doesn't allow you to do that. It does allow you to put framing guides and different tools like that to help you emulate like a 4.3 or something, but it doesn't allow you the opportunity to have open gate of your sensor. And even though it's free, and it's kind of an unfair criticism because it's free, there's some bugs in the app and you just need to be aware of them. So in the app, you have the ability to change which storage location you want the footage to be stored on. But that being said, whenever you use the app to default to an external recorder, there is times where it switches back over to the iPhone if you unplug the external recorder and then plug it back in and the app is still open. It won't automatically switch over like some other apps in this list does. Inherently, I don't think that that's a catastrophic issue. It's not like you're losing footage, it just puts it into a different place. But it is pretty annoying, and if you don't keep an eye on it, it can slow you down because you have to go back into the settings, and it's not a quick fix. You have to scroll all the way down and then find one of the sublines, and then change it to which folder you want the footage to be stored in. Now, that brings me to my second favorite app, which is an app that actually came out while I was filming this, and that's the PGYTECH camera app. Now, whenever I was on this trip, I saw on Instagram that they just launched the app, and I figured I would download it and give it a go. Now, there's some things that I really liked about that. The app offers a lot of the same features that the Blackmagic camera app offers, but it's just a different user interface. It offers Apple Log, ProRes recording, and it even offers a 4.3 recording, unlike the Blackmagic does. So that's kind of a bonus for this app. However, it doesn't have shutter angle, and so you have to get used to setting shutter speed if you've been used to setting your shutter angle. Overall, I think that this app has a very friendly user interface, and it competes with Blackmagic in that way. Also, what's really cool about this app is it's a free download, but I think that there is some in-app purchases that you can do whenever you download it. But for whatever reason, in the version that I downloaded, whenever I clicked to install and purchase the upgrades, it was just a free upgrade. So I don't know if that's something that's changing later, or if that's just something that they were giving as a gift to early adopters. Something that I think is better about this app is that if you set the app to record externally, and then you unplug the device, but then you plug the external recorder back in, like the SSD, then it automatically switches back to the SSD. Unlike the Blackmagic camera app, where you have to go back and physically change the storage location from your phone to the SSD. SSD. But there is a couple bugs in the app, which is understandable because it's version 1.0. What I found is that in 4:3 mode, the image is actually cropped to the left of the image, which tells me that they're probably just cropping the 16:9 image and not actually giving you open gate recording. And then, like I mentioned earlier, there's no shutter angle option. And they're targeting both photographers and filmmakers, so I think that that's something that they should implement, and it would be nice to have. Hopefully they're listening. And then last up is an app called Pearla. Now, this app is really unique, and it takes a new spin on what iPhone filmmaking can be. But what I mean is that this app doesn't give you Apple log. It gives you every other flavor of log that you're used to, and what it's doing is processing the raw data from the sensor and putting its own color space transform on live while it's recording. So it's taking the raw data from the sensor and then putting it to S-Log3 or ARRILog. Now, I used that app for a couple of days, and I really enjoyed it overall. However, I have seen that there is some weird artifacts, especially in the shadows, and I think that's something to do with their CST. Now, this app is very early, and I applaud them for making this because I think that this one has the best potential upside to be the #1 app. All that being said, even though this app does not have Apple log, I'm going to keep my eye on it, and I'm going to continue to use it because I really think that this app offers some of the most impressive features of any of the 3 apps, but it's number 3 just because of the artifacting and the user interface right now. While on this trip, I didn't necessarily want to haul around a lot of gear. It was primarily a family trip, and so that just didn't fit the vibe, and it would be a little bit cumbersome. But I did take 2 accessories with me that I genuinely can recommend. And the first was a ZIKE SSD. Now, ZIKE reached out to me and they sent me this to test out and review, but it's something that I genuinely think is a very good product. So this is an SSD that plugs directly into the USB-C on the iPhone. What's really cool about it is that it's an active cooled SSD. It can do 4K ProRes 422HQ at 120 frames a second. So not only can you record to it, but you can also power your phone through it. And if you're working on a professional set, then that's obviously a very important thing because it doesn't just block up your port to where you can't power your phone as well. Something that's really cool about this SSD is not only does it auto mount to your phone, but it also has a display on it that shows you the SSD health and its lifespan, the temperature of the SSD, and then the data that's going in and out of it. The SSD itself is very small, and I primarily just used it plugged into the bottom because it didn't add that much length or weight, but on the backside it's also magnetic and it lines up perfect with MagSafe. Inside the box they give you 2 different cables, one for the Pro Max and then one for the regular Pro, so you have different links that line up with your MagSafe, and I thought that was a nice little touch. The second thing that I brought with me was the Freewell ND system for the iPhone, and I bought this after a recommendation from a buddy of mine, Clark, who's also getting into iPhone filmmaking, and this system is honestly very good. It's a little bit expensive to get into. It was like $80 plus the case, but I think that this is a very good value, especially if you're using the internal NDs on the phone. And then having an ND system that magnets onto that was very efficient, and it didn't seem to add any time or complexities to just run and gun filmmaking. I will say that on this trip I took the 1 to 5 stop ND system, and it just really wasn't enough. So in the future I would get the 6 to 9 stop ND system just to keep up if you're in the bright sun. But if you're in a cloudy environment, I think 1 to 5 would be fine. Through that week, I was thinking through different ways that I would improve on my setup if I was hired to shoot something for social and I had to shoot it on a phone. And one of those things would be a lens system for the iPhone. And even though I think all 3 cameras on the iPhone are good, right now with the iPhone 15 and 16, there is one camera that is better than the others, and that's the main camera, which is their 24mm equivalent. Through my research and different YouTube reviews, I stumbled onto Sandmarc and I reached out, and they sent me out some just to test and review. And this is a system that I genuinely like and would use on a professional set. Because the 24mm on the iPhone 15 and 16 is the main camera and the best camera, sometimes you want to be a little bit wider or sometimes you want to be a little bit tighter. So I took out this Sandmarc wide angle and telephoto and practiced a little bit of that at the park. Because the iPhone main camera is 24mm, sometimes you want to be a little bit wider or a little bit tighter. Obviously, every camera takes lenses and no camera is stuck at 24mm, and so having the ability to take your 24mm main sensor and then put on a wider angle lens or a telephoto lens and get that compression is something that every filmmaker is used to and expects out of their camera, and it's no different whenever filming social content. Optically, I haven't done a thorough test on these lenses, but when you're filmmaking on the iPhone, to me, I'm not sure that it matters as much as a thorough test of cinema glass that you're putting on your main camera rig. I think is some of the characteristics and quirks that you get from filming on the iPhone. But overall, I can say that the initial impression of these lenses and the case that it comes with is really good. And then the case itself is just a smooth, soft touch plastic case that's not rubbery, so it doesn't get hung up in your pocket. Now, one thing that I would recommend is that for both the telephoto lens and the wide angle, they're both a 43mm front, and I would pick up an ND system. For this one, I just picked up one off of Amazon that was cheap. It's a KNF filter. I've used KNF filters on my FX3. I've used their bag for a lot of travel, and overall I just really like KNF stuff, and it's cheap and typically it's pretty decent quality. All that being said, I was doing some research and there's some rumors that the iPhone 17 coming out in September will have a main camera on all 3 cameras. But even if that's the case, I don't think that it necessarily rules out the need to have lenses, and I'll get into that a little bit later. During the trip, I was doing my best to hold the iPhone as steady and still as I could, but inherently the iPhone's just a very lightweight camera. So that being said, next time I would like to have a lightweight and easy to use travel tripod. So I just picked up a cheap one off of Amazon, which had very high reviews, like 4.7 stars. It's a super lightweight tripod, and it's primarily made out of plastic and aluminum, which helps them keep the weight down. Now, I was a little concerned with the tripod being plastic, but from Amazon reviews, it seems like it holds up well. It's not something that I would put a very heavyweight camera on or even an FX3, but it's something that I feel totally comfortable with my iPhone. Something that's also cool about this tripod is that it comes with like a baby boom arm, so you can put it out over a table or something and get those top-down shots, which is something that I'll probably start implementing into YouTube videos, just because after using the iPhone and starting to understand and trust its color science and its capabilities a little bit more, I'm pretty impressed. So now let's talk about what it's like to color grade iPhone footage. So Apple itself released their Apple log profile, so it's something that's recognized natively in DaVinci. That being said, there's obviously several different ways that you could color grade this. You could color grade it with plugins, you could color grade it with a CST and apply your normal grade. But what I was doing on this last trip was using DEHANCER. Now, DEHANCER is a plugin that I bought years ago, and I thoroughly enjoy, and I use it for a lot of my projects. In fact, almost every project that I've done since I bought it has some sort of DEHANCER feature onto the footage. All that being said, I hadn't done a lot of just straight DEHANCER color grading, but I've seen some people do it, and I wanted to try it on something that was low pressure like this. So last week I posted a video, and it was basically just a film emulation that was done on the iPhone. And overall, that footage I think is tricky, because whenever you get into something that doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth of field and you're just shooting landscapes and establishing shots, the iPhone can surprisingly cut in with a lot of the bigger cameras. I think if you were to show that to somebody and put it side by side with like an FX3 and FX6, and then you have the iPhone and it's just these static wides, especially if they're all locked off, then I don't know that the mass majority of the public, maybe not filmmakers, could tell the difference. That being said, I think that there's a lot of potential upside with the iPhone. Let me talk you through how I graded this footage in DEHANCER. The first plugin that I used was a plugin called Lens Node, and that helps you emulate some of the lens characteristics of different lenses. Now, this was actually a plugin that one of my fellow DP buddies, Easton, found, and we were chatting about it, and I decided to use it on this project, and I really like what it's doing. So what this plugin does is it helps you emulate different lens characteristics from a batch of different lenses. That was all professionally recreated here in Resolve. So really quick, let me enable that. So you can see here in the corner, we've got some fringing and some vignette. And what I'm trying to emulate is the Helios 44. Now, what's really cool about this plugin is you can throw it into overdrive and you can really accentuate those characteristics. You can change your sensor size. And then you can also go and you can mix and match and create different distortion settings, vignettes, blooms, etc. So that's a really fun tool, especially if you're doing film emulation. Now, I bought that with my own money, so that's a non-sponsored, non-nothing thing. The second step on this grade was a plugin called Scatter, and that's something else that I bought with my own money, and I've used it on almost every project since I've had it. What's really fun is you can emulate different styles of diffusion in front of the lens. And in fact, if you go to their website, you can see comparisons side by side with a baked-in diffusion and then something that is done in post. And Scatter does a really good job of emulating what that diffusion would look like if you baked it in. So this is the first project that I've done start to finish with only DEHANCER as my color management, but let me walk you through kind of how I'm using it and what I did on this one. DEHANCER is a plugin that I bought with my own money again, but it's a plugin that I've used nearly every time since I got it, at least using one of the tools inside of DEHANCER. At minimum, it's going to be the grain effect that they have. I like it just a little bit better than some of the other plugins. So for this particular project, I didn't use any color space transforms. I just went into DEHANCER and then chose the camera that I was shooting on. They have a pretty vast list of cameras, and in fact they're adding some more, and I just got an email that they added even more today. So something that I kept coming back to and wanting to do was pushing the exposure. Now if you're used to grading in Premiere or Final Cut, when you push the exposure you start to clip your highlights pretty fast, and DEHANCER does a pretty good job of handling that and pushing this more in a film emulation style. So I think I had this right around 0.8 or so. And then for the film emulation on this project, I chose Kodak Gold. I just thought that it fit the vibe of the entire scene the best. Something that I want to highlight is the film compression section. That's a section that if you have a really high dynamic range environment, that's going to help bring your highlights back in and save those highlights. Now, it can get a little heavy-handed sometimes where you can feel those whites clipping a little bit too low. But to me, this film compression section really helps bring everything back into levels and make it feel a little bit more film. And then lastly, these are the tools that make it almost onto every project that I touch. That's their film grain, the halation, and sometimes the bloom. So to me, DEHANCER does a really good job of different film grain stocks. Typically, I'm running 35mm 250, but I'll just poke through a few of these so you can see the differences. And then next up we have halation. Now this is something that I apply on a lot of my projects, especially if I'm using some really clean glass that doesn't have a lot of characteristics. But what it does is it just gives you that halation that you see in a lot of older lenses. Now I think it can be overdone, and it has been overdone a lot. A lot of social content, you'll see that, and they'll just crank this thing up to the max, and then maybe it's a little heavy-handed. So if I do it, I'm going to touch it just a little bit, just something that gives it a little bit of characteristic, but you know, it's a 1% tweak kind of thing. And then lastly, another thing that I apply on a lot of my projects is the vignette tool. Now, you can obviously do this on its own separate node, but with it being in DEHANCER, and since I'm almost finishing every grade with DEHANCER, I use it a lot of the times, and I use it typically pretty subtly, but it was a little bit more heavy-handed on this particular project, just because the style that I was going for. Like I said earlier, I bought this with my own money, but I did reach out to them and I said, hey, I want to do a little bit of a feature on this iPhone video that I'm doing, and they offered to create a discount code, which is 10% off. So if you type in the code Keaton, you get 10% off, and then I get a small kickback, which will help support the channel. So briefly, I want to talk about where I think that these accessories fit in the different lineups. Now, if you're going to go out and you're going to only shoot on your iPhone with the iPhone lenses, then I think the Freewell system is really good. Now, if the iPhone 17 comes out and it ends up having 3 lenses and they're all the main camera, what I said earlier is I don't think that the lenses are totally worthless. And what I mean by that is what I did was put the telephoto lens on top of the iPhone's telephoto lens. So the iPhone's around 77mm, and then I put a 58mm on there, so I'm getting somewhere around 180mm, 200mm camera on the iPhone, and it's a fun way to add more value to the iPhone camera. That being said, I'm happy to have the Sandmarc lenses, and I plan to continue to use them even if the iPhone 17 comes out and it has those main cameras and I upgrade to that. Now I want to talk about some accessories that I think I would like to have if I was doing a professional shoot. The first would be some kind of cooling apparatus. I've seen some MagSafe fans that help keep the iPhone cool, and what I noticed is that if you're filming on the iPhone, and especially if you're in the sun, the iPhone gets pretty hot. And then a lot of the times it dims the screen so that it can help conserve heat and make the iPhone less hot. But what that does is that makes your screen really dark and then you can't see what you're shooting. So if there's an apparatus that can MagSafe or whatever to the iPhone and help keep it cool in real world scenarios, that's something that I would be very open to having. And then I would probably add some kind of cage to the iPhone so it could be more modular, where you could add a microphone or an iLight, something like that. After filming on the iPhone for a couple weeks, what are my main thoughts and takeaways? I've had an iPhone since 2007. I saved up money, I mowed yards, and then bought the iPhone with my own money, which was a huge leap forward and a really cool thing for me. But I think the most surprising thing is that this camera has been in my pocket for several years and I just have not taken it seriously, and I hadn't used it in the way that it was intended and advertised to be used by Apple. I'm really surprised how good this particular camera is on the phone. With the integration of Apple Log and ProRes, especially in 422HQ, you have so much flexibility, and you have an image that could cut into a lot of documentary films, small commercials, especially if you're doing a large establishing shot or you just need to be a fly on the wall. In recent news, there's been leaks that Apple is working on an ultra-stabilized sensor, and then that they're working on a sensor that has 20 stops of dynamic range. And if they implement both of those into one system, I think it's going to be a very compelling camera to have around, especially for documentaries, small commercials, and tourism. Now, do I think it will replace cinema cameras for movies and larger commercials? Probably not. Just like DSLRs didn't replace cinema cameras, I think that it will find its place into the industry and be a very good action camera or insert shot. The iPhone inherently just lacks the I/O that the film industry wants and uses. I think that there's ways that you can build it up and add accessories. In fact, we've seen movies done on it, but I don't think that it's inherently just going to replace them because it doesn't offer the things that cinema cameras offer. But I think it'll be an increasingly good tool to have around and something that you'll see used more and more in professional sets. I think where it does fit is into social deliverables. I think that you're able to get a very high quality social deliverable with that similar iPhone feel, but you still have more control of the image and the I/O whenever you're using apps like Blackmagic. I think it's also a very strong contender for behind the scenes, crash cams, and especially documentaries, especially if you're in an area that you just don't want to draw a lot of attention to yourself. You could walk around with an iPhone, put an ND filter on it, and I don't think many people would ever turn their head. There's so many people filming on their phones nowadays, and the ability to record this type of quality into a phone is pretty impressive, and I think it's something that will open the doors and get footage in places that we haven't seen before in ways that we haven't seen them. All that being said, I think for the general public, this footage could cut in for a lot of things and no one would be the wiser. I think that the depth of field of the camera is still a dead giveaway, but for wide establishing, quick POV, crash cam stuff, this is a totally viable storytelling tool. I'm Keaton. I'm sharing my journey and what I've learned along the way. If you want to continue growing together, consider subscribing. This is just the beginning of the conversation.